Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be reviewing the Kino Blu-ray release of the 1941 The Mad Doctor, released by Paramount and often regarded as a horror film, but it's really more of a psychological thriller or melodrama with some trappings of a horror film. But it was always grouped in with other horror films, and due to the way that Paramount would sort of dabble in the horror genre, and then eventually these films would lapse in terms of rights or get sold off to Universal and just grouped in with other classic horror films in terms of television broadcasts and reissues. So over time, these films unfortunately become more obscure, but they all have a unique signature, basically more of the Paramount arty flair and higher production values. On first glance, The Mad Doctor would most closely resemble the famous Mad Doctor cycle of films that Boris Karloff would do primarily at Columbia in the 1940s, and instead of Karloff, it's a vehicle for the great Basil Rathbone. What's interesting about that whole conceit is it gives Rathbone a chance to sort of break out of his romanticized screen image and play a character who could do dastardly deeds and also wasn't just the out-and-out villain. As with this character, there are some elements of tragedy, but it's really getting back to the idea of Bluebeard and having the various women become the new wife who is then eventually disposed of. And so there's a whole string of corpses if one is willing to dig up the grisly details. The plot of the film is straightforward. Rathbone's character is a doctor who was originally from Vienna, who had to get out of town in quite a hurry when a woman turned up dead. And ever since, he's gone from country to country assuming various identities, marrying women, and ultimately disposing of them for various reasons and becoming quite wealthy in the process. This doctor, now going under the name of Dr. Sebastian, is now in the United States and has been able to carry out his various schemes with the aid of his assistant, played by Martin Kozlek. And really the highlight of the film is their dynamic of being very close but very snarky with one another and talking quite openly when alone about their various predicaments and how they have a certain wonderful, detached, morbid humor about the whole thing. And this is really where the film just opens up and lives and breathes, and you can see an entirely different and frankly better film that it could have been. And that is unfortunately a side effect of the production of this film, because it originally started life as a story and screenplay by the legendary writing team and writing partners of Charles MacArthur and Ben Hecht, most famous for The Front Page, and Ben Hecht of course went on to become one of the most legendary of all screenwriters. But their concept was to really run with this serial killer theme and try to play around with things that certainly would have gotten them in hot water with the production code. So there's also the sense that this is something that they could have gotten away with more in a play or certainly in a pre-code film. And one can only imagine the sort of film that we could have gotten had we been able to really just follow around the doctor and his assistant, living the high life and stacking up corpse after corpse of dead wives and absconding away with their money and, of course, adding to their fortune they had amassed. It, of course, also helps that Dr. Sebastian is able to pose as a psychiatrist, which, of course, allows him to further insinuate himself among high society. The eventual film, of course, had to have many changes made, and Basil Rathbone, when he signed on, wanted some changes made, I suppose in order to not have something almost alien to his overall screen persona, but this was still a chance for him to sort of stretch out and do something a little bit different instead of the usual typecasting he found himself in as, at first, sort of dashing romantic figure, but very quickly that transformed into being typecast as the out-and-out villain. This role really gives him elements of both, and it's nice to see him be able to play something that's not really either, because it has dark and light elements, and it's a character in constant struggle with his internal demons. So the main bulk of the film's plot is the doctor and associate moving to a new town, and the doctor setting his sights on a new conquest, played by Ellen Drew, but this time he swears things things are going to be different because he actually starts to fall in love with this woman who does have various legitimate issues, including suicidal tendencies, which is quite striking to see in a 1941 film, as this even predates the Val Lewton cycle at RKO. John Howard gets the rather thankless role of being the would-be suitor who is distrustful of this flamboyant psychiatrist, and as he's a newspaperman as well, he decides he's going to try and expose him. All of these elements are much more mundane and start to feel rather formulaic. The screenplay was actually completed by Howard J. Green, who was famous for films like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang and Morning Glory, among many other films. But it's quite surprising how The Mad Doctor, in its final form, resembles in its plotting much more of a B film. Again, very similar in some ways to the Karloff Mad Doctor films, which were all B film programmers. The difference here is that this film is being made at Paramount, and it's given basically the trappings of an A film. So it's a very clearly a B film trying to look like an A film, because you have the opulence of production design and more money and the gorgeous photography by Ted Tetzlaff, one of the great cinematographers of all time, who went on to become a very good director in his own right. He directed the suspense masterpiece The Window, which is one of the most suspenseful films ever made. But his photography is really the visual highlight. It's one of four aspects of this film that make it special and worth watching. It's really the performances of Basil Rathbone and Martin Kozlek, combined with Ted Tetzlaff's beautiful photography, and this having the opulence and sort of arty European flavor typical of Paramount films. That was really the studio's identity, and that seeps into even The Mad Doctor, which otherwise, had it been made anywhere else or made strictly as a B film, it would be pretty much a B film programmer. There's not really anything else in the story to draw one's interest, and really outside of the Doctor and his assistant, there's not a whole lot of depth to the other characters. And some, including the small-town doctor played by Ralph Morgan, who we see at the opening of the film and then who turns up later for the final act, perform various behaviors that seem rather nonsensical and silly, and are all essentially because the plot dictated them, and that sort of reeks of B-film programmer not really having depth to side characters. So again, that's why the performances of Rathbone and Kozlek are the most striking. As great as Ellen Drew is, she doesn't really get much to do in the film. And for poor John Howard, he's given practically nothing. He has to be the straight man and is very unlikable because he doesn't really have much of a character. So again, you can feel that it's a B film in there. You can see how it started out with lofty ideas and was a much darker, more arresting film idea. You may not know how or why, but when you start digging into it, you realize that originally it started out as a much darker story based on real-life serial killers by the legendary team of Hecht and MacArthur. Then you start to understand why there are these threads of interest in the film that make it more rewarding than it really should be. The melodrama is, of course, can this serial killer doctor truly reform? Are these two truly in love? How will this affect his relationship with his doting, perhaps more than friends, assistant, who's the one who has to do all the dirty work and get rid of the bodies, sometimes even exhume bodies when things get a bit too hot in terms of police interest? And of course, what will happen with the small-town doctor who comes to the big city finally ready to talk? And of course, the reporter out to prove this doctor is nothing more than a fraud. I think all the elements are there for a satisfying film, even if it's more of a B film scale story, sort of blown up to more of an A film status. But I think David Delval's commentary is right in making the distinction that it probably is a film that has the wrong director for it. This was directed by Tim Whelan, who started his career actually writing for some of the most famous Harold Lloyd silent comedies, along with some of the famous Harry Langdon silent comedies. He eventually moved to directing and did a lot of work in Britain, and even directed films like Q Planes, but most famously the 1940 version of The Thief of Baghdad. But if you look through his filmography, nothing really jumps out and says horror film, psychological thrillers, psychological melodrama, horror melodrama, and that very much is apparent in this film. It has a sort of matter-of-fact quality that even the beautiful atmosphere of it being a Paramount film and Tetzlaff's gorgeous photography can never fully overcome. You get the sense that had this been directed by somebody who was more suited to the material, that the film would have at least flowed better, and the sort of plot contrivances and more silly B-film type writing would have at least flowed better. And maybe we might have even gotten more focus on the Rathbone and Kozlek characters, who are the most interesting thing in the film and what makes it truly unique. Not only is it a film that is having to deal with the production code constraints, but it's also a film that started out as something much darker and has been watered down and transformed. It's also a B film being dressed up or masquerading as an A film, and it's Paramount dabbling in horror, which is not something they were always very comfortable doing. When you look at the group of films that Paramount made during the studio era that could be labeled horror films, you can see a sort of reluctance. They wanted to try and, as in The Mad Doctor, push it more into melodrama. And even when they would bring in specialists or other people, it would have a sort of Paramount stamp on it of a sort of high gloss or an arty flair, but it wouldn't necessarily have the same harder hitting quality as, say, a Universal out-and-out horror film. Easily the best and most striking of the horror films that Paramount made was, of course, the 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which had the benefit of the sheer artistry of Ruben Mamoulian and being a pre-code film that was able to swing for the fences and be as gloriously dark and nasty as it wanted to. And you don't really get that here. Of course, now it's 1940 and the film was released in 1941, but it's only when the film commits to what it's trying to do, where the atmosphere and the gorgeous visuals, and especially Rathbone's performance, it's in certain moments where the constraints sort of fall away and you can see what the film ultimately could have been. It's a good and enjoyable film, but you can't get away from the fact that it's not what it could have been, and it's not what it originally started life as. And in that way, it is always going to be a compromised film, and it will be a mixed bag to most viewers. The real joy is seeing Basil Rathbone get to play a role with aspects that were not typically part of his screen persona. He is, of course, a serial killer and a villain at the end of the day, but he's also a dashing romantic figure, and there's an element of tragedy in his backstory. So there's a lot of things going on, and I think chiefly you see Rathbone enjoying getting to do something that wasn't Sherlock Holmes, because he was already locked into that image. Of course, the Fox films had come out, and the Universal films were starting up in terms of the rest of the cycle with Nigel Bruce that had been transposed to being World War II films. But this is one star vehicle expressly for Rathbone where he gets to do something different, and that's the greatest highlight of the film. And again, you have that at its highest in all of the scenes with Rathbone and Kozlek beautifully playing off of one another. The commentary also goes into how Kozlek said that he and Rathbone became friends, and they would try and improvise and add bits to all of those scenes and add certain subtext, which is why I think people can quite rightly read the characters' relationship as being more than friends. And it's amazing they were able to get that past the production code. But that's why the film is most interesting when it's the two of them, and you could easily have an entire film with this unlikely duo and how beautifully they play off of one another. Every time they're on screen, you're excited and interested, and then they're not on screen together anymore, and your interest dips down. and you have to wait for their next appearance together. The Mad Doctor is an interesting film to study, but it is always going to be a compromised experience. And the biggest giveaway is that the first time you see this film, you can actually feel the what ifs and the, oh, wow, that was interesting. Why couldn't we go down that pathway? Oh, no, we're locked into this groove, essentially. And by the end, the production code sort of swoops in and causes a unbelievably unlikely and illogical note to the final conclusion that doesn't even make sense, and the commentary even highlights that moment. So again, it's a compromise film. It ultimately is a B film that is sort of dressed up like a Paramount A film, and there are great highlights and a fantastic lead cast. So you make of it what you will. It's not an out-and-out horror film, but it is a fascinating film to study and come back to, especially for Basil Rathbone fans, because it's a vehicle expressly made to showcase his talents and a wonderful role that was outside his usual typecasting. Now, in terms of the Kino Blu-ray, this is an HD master from Universal, who took over most of the Paramount library, which is why a number of the Paramount horror films, such as Supernatural, are also held by Universal. I wish I could say this was a beautiful restored master, but unfortunately it's an older scan of seemingly a print element, as it looks pretty good, but it is filled with heavy wear. You will see frame movement, scratches, lines, a lot of wear, especially on the fades and transitions. You will see, obviously, transitional loss from going to dupe materials and then have to wait for the pop back in to clearer looking materials. So I don't know if this was a print that they scanned, but it certainly seems like it. Ted Tetzlaff's photography does, of course, shine through because it's absolutely gorgeous, but even that is heavily compromised due to the wear and the source that's used. I don't know if anything better survives, but this is a film that certainly could use a beautiful restored master, but obviously it being a much more obscure, little-known horror film from 1941 that is not actually an out-and-out horror film and doesn't have as big of a horror name, in spite of it having both Rathbone and Kozlek in the cast, it's not likely this film will get a restoration anytime soon. And this is certainly the best presentation it's had, as the film has seemingly lapsed into the public domain, or is one of those where the rights are sort of in limbo and public domain companies have decided to just go ahead and put out crappy transfers of it. So you can actually see versions of this film floating around, even on YouTube or online uploads that are in varying stages of low quality. It's not a particularly very long film, so there's that as well. But it's definitely looking its best in this master, in spite of all of the compromises in terms of the damage that's here. The overall presentation is good in terms of the encoding being solid, but not exceptional. It's basically another classic horror film from damaged, worn elements that is being presented by Kino on a disc that's it's basically, I would say, it's a preservation master. It's like all their other Blu-rays of preservation masters of horror films from the 20s, 30s, 40s, or like some of their Blu-rays of the PRC films, where it's got a lot of wear and damage, but it's certainly the best we've ever seen compared to the horrible, crummy versions it's had in the past. Just don't go into this expecting a beautifully restored master that's perfectly respectful of Ted Tetzlaff's gorgeous photography. We just have to be thankful that at least we can appreciate that photography as much as possible in this master for, basically looking at it for what it is. But again, it's filled with damage and wear and fluctuations and dips in quality, and it's solid. It could be a lot worse, and it's definitely the best we've ever seen for this film. The audio is the original mono mix here in a lossless DTS HDMA presentation. Now, this does have plenty of wear and inherent damage, just like the picture, and does have moderate hiss and some occasional ticks and pops and a little bit of crackle and distortion here and there. It does sound obviously a little bit thin, and given this is a universal master, I'm sure it's been hit with a degree of audio processing, just like their other masters of classic Paramount horror films, but thankfully nowhere near as bad as some of those. So it still sounds healthy enough. I just don't have anything else to compare it against outside of the various really crummy uploads and public domain versions. I think it does seem obvious, though, that there was at least some degree of noise reduction applied. I would personally prefer it had they just left it as is, but for general cleanup, it seems fine and healthy enough, and this was obviously not a great source to begin with because it's of limited quality, just like the picture materials are. For packaging and artwork, we have a reproduction of the original one-sheet poster, which looks quite nice. Otherwise, it's just the generic Kino Lorber spine, their generic rear cover, at least with some nice images, and the usual generic label. The supplemental features include a fantastic David Delval commentary, which is excellent like his other commentaries on Kino releases. He, of course, knew and interviewed Martin Kozak many times, who was able to tell him a bit about the production of the film and his relationship with Basil Rathbone. Delval also knows a great deal about Rathbone's personal life and overall career, and it basically goes into the highs and severe lows of Rathbone's career, and also examining where the Mad Doctor fits into all of that, and how it was a film that allowed him to sort of break out of his usual screen persona. There's also discussion and analysis of the original Ben Hecht, Charles MacArthur approach and their original story, and how that became the eventual product of the Mad Doctor, which ultimately is a film that can escape the trappings of a B film and the story compromises that do limit its potential. And all of this is covered in the commentary, which is jam-packed full of information and anecdotes, and is a wonderful way to spend 90 minutes of your time. So it's another of the great essential tracks found on a Kino release. The only other extras are trailers. So we have the trailer for the film itself, which is in HD. It does have plenty of wear and distortion in the audio, but the transfer for the trailer, so the trailer itself looks significantly better than the feature transfer. So if you were curious to see what the film might look like if the transfer element was a bit better, or if you wondered what seeing this film in a theater would be like, or if you wondered just how good Ted Tetzlaff's photography is, you can actually go to the trailer and see a superior visual impression for certain select bits, obviously cut together in a trailer. But it's great that that's been retained, as most vintage trailers don't always survive, and it does hint at what a restored master of this film could look like. And as Kino likes to do, but for whatever reason not actually put on the packaging, they include a gallery of other trailers that are somehow connected to the film you're watching. So here we have a trailer for The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, which is in HD and is the same one they use on all these different releases that have a gallery that include this trailer. Again, it is in HD. It does have some wear, but it's perfectly presentable. Then we have a trailer for The Black Sleep, which is in 4:3 and standard definition, so it's a noisy upscale. It's also a textless trailer, so it's the trailer without the text that was supposed to go over the screen, but at least that's properly presented here, even though it's an old standard definition trailer. Then we have a trailer for The Undying Monster, which is also in standard definition. It's quite noisy, so the quality isn't the greatest. And then finally we have a trailer for Fox's remake of The Lodger, which is another standard definition, very noisy, low quality trailer inclusion here. It's also another that's a textless trailer, so it doesn't have the text to go over the shots that with more of the hype for the film. The audio also has quite a bit of hiss, so it's not very high quality. I do enjoy the idea of having trailers for other releases that are somehow connected, whether it's an actor, actress, or director, or writer, but you do have to always go through every trailer that Kino includes because they're not always high quality files. Sometimes they have encoding problems or the frame rate is poor. So you have to actually watch through all of these because sometimes there are technical issues or the quality is not the greatest and they're just kind of tacked on. But that's the whole concept of this. They just tack on a variety of trailers in varying quality to perhaps entice the viewer to check out more of their releases. So that is the Kino Lorber release of the 1941 film The Mad Doctor. It's a film that's unfortunately defined by its compromises, but it is still a remarkably interesting film, particularly if you like studying the films of studios such as Paramount and MGM that didn't often dabble in the more horror realms, and they might produce films like this that are compromised or feel like they're forcing other elements but also playing it safe at the same time. Ultimately, it's a film that is most striking for the lead performances of Basil Rathbone and Martin Kozlik, and also Ted Tetzlaff's gorgeous photography, and getting to see the Paramount flavor and the high gloss and the greater production values on a film about a mad doctor serial killer that otherwise feels like a B film plot. The Kino Blu-ray is certainly the best presentation we've had for the film yet. It's unlikely this film will see any further restoration attempts anytime soon, and the Kino Blu-ray does have a fantastic commentary, which of course increases the value exponentially. So I do highly recommend this for fans of late 30s, early 40s horror films, and especially this is a must-see for any fan of Basil Rathbone, as it's one of the handful of leading star vehicles that he had that also didn't try and shoehorn him into his usual typecasting. And for that alone, this is a must-see. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films and their physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, the Kino Blu-ray of The Mad Doctor is really the only decent presentation it seems to have had, and is far superior to all of the crummy versions you're going to find floating around. So I would encourage people to get the Kino Lorber release as opposed to watching the film on one of the not very good crummy versions that's floating around. As always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc in order to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.